begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners whose land we're all gathered on. I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty over this land it's never been ceded, and it is and always will be Aboriginal land. And in this moment of coronavirus, and when we're talking about housing and homelessness, it's worth mentioning that for First Nations people, this issue affects them first and worst, both the coronavirus and the issue of underfunding of housing. So it's a very critical issue, and it's on all of us to make sure that we're working for First Nations justice in our work. We've got some questions about audio happening in the chat. So I'd like to introduce Jess, who's our tech support. If you have any tech issues, she'll be answering them. So that's great use of the chat. And while we're just getting set up, my name's Kirsty. I'm the Executive Director at Australian Progress, and I'll be hosting Australia at Home today. While we're getting set up, it would be great if you could turn your video on so we can see everyone's face. This is a space for civil society to come together and share the big ideas, understand the challenges we're facing in this moment, and cheer each other on. So if you can, please put on your video, and I recommend going up to the top right corner and putting gallery view on. So there's 9 boxes in the top right corner. That means you'll be able to see everyone's face. So if you would like to just take a moment, in the bottom there's a chat. It would be great if you could just introduce yourself, and we'll be using the chat to be asking questions and putting in comments. And if you have links to resources or other things you'd like to share, please do share them in the chat. Before we hand over to our facilitators today, I just want to introduce a bit about what Australia at Home is if you haven't come before. It's a weekly lunchtime, a daily lunchtime conversation for civil society to connect and support each other and hear and understand the issues that are happening in the midst of this crisis. And there are a few ground rules. So one is we're recording this session. It will be available afterwards. And if you want to see past sessions, you're welcome to do that. In general, we'll keep people on mute, but if you have a question, we'll throw to you and invite you to speak up. So please ask your questions in the chat. And the final thing is that we are still learning. So if there's any tech issues at all, Jess will be helping you out. But this is a quick work in progress to bring our movements together and civil society to really connect and chat about the big issues. And today we'll be talking about housing and homelessness. The session today is called Stay Aware, how this pandemic really highlights some of the issues in housing in our society. So I'm really excited to be handing over to Joel Dignam from Better Renting, who will be hosting the session today. And he'll be moderating a conversation between Kate Colvin from Everybody's Home. Hello, Kate's giving us all a wave. And Maiy Azize from Anglicare. So really excited to have a conversation between these three. And I'll hand over to you now, Joel.
Great. Thank you, Kirsty. And hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people chiming in, and I hope you're all enjoying your lunchtimes as we come together. So my name is Joel Dignam. I'm the Executive Director of Better Renting. Better Renting is a community of renters working together for stable, affordable and healthy homes. And so it's obviously coronavirus has been a massive issue for a lot of people and for a lot of different issues in our society. But it's been really interesting for me seeing renting issues get a lot of attention because they typically don't. And with many of us, even if you maybe aren't working in this field like I am, would have seen the National Cabinet conversation around eviction moratoriums and that tricky negotiation that's going on all over Australia between individual landlords and individual tenants at this time. So I come to this from that sort of renting background, which sort of looks at, I guess, the situation for people who rent, but also for their landlords to some extent. But when we look at housing more broadly, there are other dimensions to this too. So with coronavirus, homelessness is a particular issue and what we can do around people who might be in that place and how we can make sure we have enough housing for all. So it's really great to be joined by Kate and Maiy, because I think we'll be able to build a pretty good picture together. And I'm also really interested in the perspectives and questions and comments we'll be able to hear from those of you who are dialing in today. So what it's going to look like today is we'll start off by talking a bit about what's happened to date. So it's all moved very quickly, but in the last sort of 4 weeks or so, what have we seen happen in the housing space? And to some extent, what has been the context of that leading up to this? What is government trying to achieve? How well do we think we've achieved the outcomes we want to see in the housing space? And then we'll have a bit of a chance to talk about that and hear your questions. But then I guess we'll be turning to the future and say, well, what maybe has changed fundamentally around how we think about this issue in Australia, and what perhaps would we want to be doing differently forward, or what new opportunities are there for how we think about this issue, or the sorts of changes that we seek. So I'm really excited to have that forward-looking conversation. Certainly in my view, it feels like a lot of things have become pretty clear around housing in Australia that maybe were a bit more concealed before. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself around what we might see in that space. So first, in just a moment, I'll throw to Kate and then to Maiy, who'll each, I guess, give a bit of a sense from their perspectives around where things are at now and what sort of led up to this point. And then we'll spend a bit of time hearing from all of you. So thank you. And Kate, you've got the floor.
So I'm Kate Colvin, so I'm the national spokesperson for the Everybody's Home campaign, which is a national campaign working on housing and homelessness issues. And it's been such an interesting time watching this, the whole coronavirus debate unfold, because, you know, we've been working for over a year now, trying to get, you know, the government to better recognise housing for everyone. And then I think there's been no moment like the virus for people to really start to understand how important housing is to our health. So everyone's been told to stay at home, get into your home, and, you know, of course, that presents a whole set of issues. Like, there's a whole bunch of people who, of course, don't have a home. And there's been a lot of focus on that, a lot of focus on rough sleeping. But there's also a bunch of people Australia who are in really, you know, terrible housing. Someone's just saying
Sorry, Kate.
That my vote, I'm going to take the headphones off because I think that's with the audio.
Great. If that doesn't work, maybe also to slow down a little bit too.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Don't talk so fast. Can people hear me better now? Okay, good. So what I was just saying was Australians for Affordable Housing has been focusing on housing for over a year, and now it's like totally the national conversation because everyone's been told to stay at home. And so now we realise, I think the media has really been jumping on this issue and realising that, you know, there's a whole set of people who don't have a home. What I think they're recognising a little bit less, it's been just a little bit touched on in the media, is that there's a whole set of people in Australia, over 51,000 households, who do have a home, but it's really overcrowded. So people who need more than 4 bedrooms just to make their home like a decent place to live. And that's a terrible risk for people in the context of a, you know, a really, a virus that can spread really easily. So that's a, you know, an issue I sort of haven't seen that much attention focused on. But I just wanted to touch on sort of what's happened politically since the issue first hit and how that affects housing. So, you know, first up, I think we saw the first kind of national cabinet really just focus on the economy. And, you know, there was nothing there, like people had already started losing their jobs, you know, and I think the first thing when people lose their jobs is they think, oh my God, how the hell am I going to pay the rent? And there was nothing there for them. But then in the next cabinet, that actually did come through. So we saw the federal government double the New Start payment. We saw the $750 payments. And then I think it was the national cabinet after that, or perhaps one more, there was a couple of disappointments, but then we did see, you know, the government introduce a ban on evictions. And I think that was a real high point where you thought, oh my God, you know, the governments around the country are really going to ban evictions. But one of the things that I think we can talk about a bit more through this session is that it's been implemented in a really patchy fashion. So we thought, you know, a ban on evictions, you think that means a ban on evictions, but actually it seems like what it means is, like, for example, in New South Wales, it's like a ban on evictions if, therefore, because someone's lost income because of coronavirus, if it's a significant reduction in their earnings, and then they can still be evicted in certain circumstances, and so it's kind of not really a ban on evictions, and it's certainly not a ban on all evictions, because if someone is, say, evicted in states where they still have no reason notice to vacate, if they're evicted for no reason, not because they have lost income and are not paying the rent, then they still can be evicted. So that's an area where I think we need some more advocacy. And then another issue is that it looks like, we've had an increase in New Start, we've had the JobKeeper payment come in. Those are all really positive, but there's still a whole set of people who don't have enough income to pay their rent. And there's sort of two sides to that question. So there's the question of should the rent be reduced? And we've seen really patchy set of measures. So, some states have mandatory schemes where landlords are required to enter negotiations and potentially reduce the rent. And other states don't have that at all. So, you can have situations where people have been paying quite high rents, because rents are pretty high, particularly in capital cities, and they've suffered a big loss of income and they can't pay the rent and the landlord won't reduce it. And then some households will, like if you've got a JobKeeper payment, you might have enough income to pay that rent, not necessarily, and those households are not eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance. And if you're paying a low rent and you've got double New Start now, well, yes, you might be able to afford to pay the rent, but a lot of households are not eligible for New Start, like temporary residents and asylum seekers. But then also, even though we think, doubling New Start, that's a lot of extra money, New Start was just so low and rents are so high that there still is a lot of households who can't afford rent. So there's been a lot of collaboration around the advocacy on these issues. And I think the general picture of that collaborative advocacy is that we've been pushing for rents to be reduced in the first instance, but we're also looking at what needs to happen in terms of additional income support for people, whether that's increasing Commonwealth rent assistance or more income payments, or an emergency, a set of emergency measures to make sure that if people are in hardship and they're trying to pay rent, that they have the income that they need. So I think probably I might leave it. Actually, I will just add that there's also been a set of measures around the nation to respond to rough sleepers. And again, it's patchy because it's state by state. So some states like Victoria, I think Queensland, have put up hotel rooms and made sure that rough sleepers are going into hotel rooms and are not sleeping rough during this time. And other states, we haven't yet heard an announcement from the Northern Territory, and I don't think Tasmania has sort of stepped up in that space, are not actually doing that yet. So, we still do have people who are rough sleeping at this terribly dangerous time, and that's another area that needs some more advocacy. So I might stop there and pass over or back to Joel or down to Maiy.
Thanks, Kate. I'm not sure if Joel wanted to jump in and say anything, but if not, I might jump in. Firstly, can everyone hear me? Great, okay. Well, I kind of want to just take a step back and start out by saying that housing has been in crisis for years, long before COVID in Australia. And so I kind of want to go way back to kind of contextualise what I'm going to say. So in the late 80s and early 90s, the government started walking away from providing affordable housing for people itself, and most of its policy intervention started focusing on propping up the private rental market and helping people into the private rental market that way. So walking away from its commitment to public housing, social housing. That was happening at all levels of government. So the federal government funding to states started declining, and state government commitments to public and social housing side are declining. I think most people here would agree that that approach has failed, and affordability has really been crashing ever since. Every year, Anglicare Australia puts out something called the Rental Affordability Snapshot, which does a bit of the, it takes all of the ads for rentals, private rentals, off of from online, usually between 60 and 70,000 ads on a snapshot weekend, and it tests them to see how many of those are affordable for different household types on low incomes. And every year we see that the private rental market is failing for people on low incomes. So we look at people on the minimum wage, couples on a minimum wage with children, people on New Start. Last year we found that out of 67,000 rental ads, there was just one rental in all of Australia that was affordable for a person on New Start. So I just wanted to kind of contextualise that, because now what we're seeing is that renters, especially renters on low income, are really vulnerable and at the front line of this pandemic. A lot of people are losing their incomes, and some of them are scared of being forced out of their homes and not sure what they're going to do about their rents. As Kate said, there have been welfare increases which have given a lot of Australians some badly needed relief. We've seen, New Start doubled, and we've seen some wage subsidies come in, but the private rental market is still failing people on the lowest incomes. And there are also a lot of people who have been left out of those benefits. So just a bit of a shout out to age pensioners and people with disability who have been completely left out of the coronavirus supplement. We're actually putting out our next rental affordability snapshot in 2 weeks, and we expect to see that older people and people with a disability are going to be really particularly disadvantaged this year and find it a bit harder to compete. We've seen a moratorium on evictions, which both Kate and Joel have mentioned, and that was a really good start. But as Kate mentioned again, what it's really done is left a lot of people confused. So people can't be evicted because they're in financial stress, but in most of the country, they can still be evicted for no reason at all. And it doesn't make a material difference to them, which reason is being nominated. And we're already seeing some stories from the front line of people being evicted with nowhere to go. Our friends at the Tenants Union of New South Wales, I'm not sure if we've got anyone from the Tenants Union of New South Wales joining, but they collated a really great list of stories. In some parts of the countries, we're even seeing tenants being evicted from public housing, and that's in the midst of a health crisis, and that's a real concern to Anglicare Australia. Governments should really be leading private landlords by example, but instead they're making a mockery of this whole idea of an eviction moratorium. And then I think the other thing I'd just throw in there is that there was a code of conduct for tenants that was announced a week ago by the National Cabinet, and we were very excited about it. And then we looked at it, and it wasn't actually a code of conduct for renters, it was just a code of conduct for businesses, so commercial tenants. And so we haven't really seen any relief for renters out of anything that's been announced. So I think I'll put that out there and leave it there.
Great. Thank you, Maiy, and thank you, Kate, too. We'll swap to questions in a moment, but I think I'll just add 2 points that I sort of want to put into this picture as well. And so we've heard from Kate and Maiy about people who might be renting or in overcrowded housing or homeless or sleeping rough. I think one other group that's part of this picture, and I don't normally get too caught up in this group, but it's worth noting that there are some property investors who are actually very now.
Joel, you're breaking up a little.
They do own a small amount. The others are in a bad. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Say that again. I'll do the best I can.
No, you just broke up and then went really fast. And just go again.
Classic. I just wanted to note that in Australia, there's a whole industry of trying to get people to buy real estate. Sometimes some people who make money by getting people to buy real estate. They sell books, they sell DVDs. And so some people get manipulated into making these investments, and they're really not in a position to actually sustain those investments if the market turns in any way. So we have, this is obviously a bad situation for people who rent, but there's definitely also some asset owners who have a lot of debt and who have very little buffer if the winds turn. And so I think that's part of what makes the situation interesting. Another thing I'd just like to note, which sort of comes off what Maiy said, the government has put in this code of conduct for commercial renters and their landlords. And I think what's different about that space is really just how it's seen. People see commercial landlords as being businesses and corporations, and commercial tenants as being small businesses who need a bit of a helping hand. But when it comes to the residential space, it's not seen in that way. Residential landlords aren't seen as being businesses or for-profit operators. They're often also seen as people who need a helping hand. And the renters in those properties are maybe seen perhaps as being less deserving than small business owners in a commercial tenancy arrangement. So I think that's just another thing to note about where we are at this point and what's happened so far. But now I think we might have some questions. I believe we've got one from Rhonda Small, if you'd like to come off mute. Sorry, this might take a moment for them to get to you and put your question.
Okay, hi everyone. I mean, I'm just, as has been noted by Maiy, I mean, the problem with housing security is a long-standing one, and it's partly related to the fact that governments, both state and federal, particularly federal, but state governments as well, just haven't invested in public and community housing. And the schemes that have come up have often been public-private partnerships that have real problems selling off public assets to try and increase the amount of public housing, and they're really moving far too slowly. And everybody in the sector actually knows that this is not going to produce the amount of secure housing that we need. So I guess my question is really, particularly as you said, Joel, I mean, the coronavirus situation has highlighted a lot of existing problems with how we organise society, and one of them is that we don't have ongoing, secure, low-cost housing for our community in an equitable way. So, you know, one of the stimulus things that could happen would be that governments are encouraged, and, you know, we actually fight really hard to get them to see that an investment in stimulus post this crisis would be a huge public investment in the building of public housing, like happened after the Second World War, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that was just, how do we do this is my question. How do we get them to do it?
Thanks, Rhonda. Maiy, do you want to start on that one? And we'll soon come to a question from Kirsty as well, which I think, Kate, you'll be well suited for.
Sure. I think there's two things that need to change. Unfortunately, this is one of those answers that just opens up, it kind of just leads to more questions. So I'm sorry about that. But I think, yeah, two things need to change. And one of them is we need to broaden the idea of who has access to government housing, you know, and social housing. And we need to find a way to get more people to see themselves, you know, in government and social housing, and just expand that idea. It hasn't always been the case that it's been so narrowly defined. You know, I think I'm from Canberra, and there was a point in time where Canberra was about 70% public housing. And it was, you know, it housed all kinds of people, middle class people. It was used to attract public servants to Canberra. And so I think that's really the second part of the equation, which is getting governments to see housing as infrastructure. It could be more, you know, shovel ready than any other infrastructure or train or whatever project that they could have on the go. And it is also a really good way, you know, low cost government housing to attract people to regions. So thinking not just about COVID, but also the recent bushfires, you know, towns, areas that want to revitalise, government housing could be part of a strategy to do that. I think the challenge is really changing the way people see public housing and reversing some of the negative connotations that have come with public housing over the years. Because I think if demand comes from the community and people start to see housing as an entitlement and start to expect government to provide housing as a service and housing as an infrastructure, I think that's where the change will come from. It'll have to come from the public, not from the top down.
Can I just jump in there too, Joel, because I think part of the answer is about the style of the advocacy that we do. So we've been, organisations have been making the case for greater government investment in social housing, public and community housing, you know, for a lot of years for different reasons, and particularly to end homelessness and deal with rent stress. But those messages are not always heard. And I think one of the advantages at this time is that I think the public, the general public are kind of really seeing how important housing is. And one of the reasons that we set up Everybody's Home as an alliance across a whole number of organisations, not being just from one organisation, is that we saw the importance of having community members out there in the community, voters, like being active with the issue, so that it's not just about a conversation between community sector organisations and government, and then government can kind of just ignore community sector organisations, but it's a conversation as a set of citizens about what we value in our community and what's important. And I think now that people can see how important housing is, it's really an opportunity to further grow the strength of that campaign and have, Australian citizens stand up for the housing rights of everybody.
Great, thank you, Kate. And maybe towards the end we'll soon be talking more about where we go from here, but maybe at the very end we can talk about some of those specific opportunities for people to stand up. Kirsty, I've got a question from you.
Thank you. I jumped in even though I've been moderating, so everyone else should jump in with questions as well. But I was really disturbed to see the video coming out of NITV of a group of Aboriginal people being moved on quite aggressively by the police. Some rough sleepers, all their stuff thrown away, and then where are they supposed to go in this moment? And I know it's not a new issue. There's been chronic underfunding of Aboriginal housing for decades, and also we know over-policing of homeless people who are sleeping rough, and Aboriginal communities happens all the time, but it's still disturbing to see that in this moment of crisis. And so I just wanted to understand, do you think that over-policing is happening of rough sleepers, people who are sleeping rough in other states and territories, and what has been the response from the police and from different states? Is that happening elsewhere, and what should we be doing to stop it?
Can I jump in with that? That was in Western Australia, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, and I think that's Western Australia is one of the states that's been really slow to move to do much to assist rough sleepers. So they've done a lot of media about I think one hotel that they've worked with, which has taken now I think 60 people, but there's a lot more people rough sleeping on the streets of Perth and in other areas in Western Australia than that, and including a lot of Aboriginal people. And I think one of the issues there is partly sort of specific to Western Australia, but I think it's also common to the way that Aboriginal issues are often dealt with sort of separately. So, whilst the broader community might feel a lot of empathy for rough sleepers, sometimes that empathy is not like Aboriginal communities are treated differently in the media, different in policy. And so I think one of the things that we really need to do is stand up as a community and, express our common view that all rough sleepers and all communities need to be well housed. And there are really particular issues for Aboriginal communities. In cities, there's that, overrepresentation among rough sleepers, but then there's also the issues in remote communities. It's actually not just unique to remote communities, but overcrowding, which I mentioned before, is a huge risk when you've got multi-generational families squashed into a house, which includes people who are frail or have disabilities, and if the virus gets into that household, then those people are really at risk. So yeah, I think that is another opportunity to stand up and do some advocacy. I think we really need to particularly perhaps push the Western Australian government to do better. Certainly in Victoria, we haven't seen that response that I'm aware of from the police, and all rough sleepers, hotel accommodation has been made available to everyone who's rough sleeping, which is a really positive thing. It does make you wonder though, how come we couldn't do that at other times? And also I think another question that the whole rough sleepers into hotels, because it kind of invites, is what are we going to do at the end of the crisis? We can't just close the hotel, push people back to the street. We have to be thinking about a long-term solution. And I think Maiy was mentioning that about how important, and Rhonda, that came up in the questions, how important it is for us to segue from emergency responses into long-term solutions, like the need for social housing as a stimulus to get us out of this mess economically, but also to deliver for people who are struggling in the housing market.
Yeah. I won't, I agree with everything Kate has said completely, and so I won't repeat any of it. I will just make a few comments about the policing. I won't get into, any of the debates about which sorts of measures are appropriate, but I do think that, we need some accountability about the way they're being policed. Some figures came out last week from New South Wales, which showed that Coonamble, which has a third of its population is Indigenous, had 10% of the New South Wales infringement notices, COVID infringement notices, and it's got like less than 0.04% of the state's population, and it has no COVID cases. A lot of the fines are being issued in Western Sydney, which has a large Indigenous population, but also just a lot of disadvantage. We're seeing. We're not seeing the policing follow where the COVID hotspots are, and so I think as always, we've always just got to be mindful when we're calling for things or calling for restrictions that these things are not going to be equally policed. So I think we should keep that in mind, and that's a bigger conversation than just housing. But I think besides that, I'd really just echo what Kate said about using this as an opportunity to get rough sleepers off the street, using this as an opportunity to get people into certain hotels and Airbnbs, and then make a long-term plan about what we're going to do to get people off the street sleeping rough. And do it before it gets too cold as well, because people who are sleeping rough are particularly vulnerable to COVID, and it's about to get really cold in most parts of the country.
Thank you, Maiy. Thanks, questioners, and Kate. I'm going to throw it back to Kate and Maiy again, just to sort of talk a bit more about where things might go from here. So we're sort of moving there. We've been talking about public and community housing, but give them a chance to think a bit big about some new ideas. Obviously, we all already had ideas for what should change in our housing system, but I'm particularly interested in sort of what is now maybe possible that wasn't possible before, or what are we thinking about or seeing differently? So let's start with Maiy this time. We'll mix it up, and then we'll go back to the floor and hear for more questions and have plenty of time for more discussion. Thanks, Maiy.
I think the first thing is to make sure that the income support increases are permanent. I think it's going to be really, really hard and unfair in 6 months to ask people who are out of work to go back to living on $40 a day when they've gotten used to living on double that. It doesn't matter how a person became unemployed, whether they lost their job a year ago or whether they lost their job in the COVID pandemic. Everyone who's out of work deserves the same respect and dignity, and it's not cheaper for you to navigate cost of living in Australia if you lost your job outside of the COVID pandemic. I think we've got a better chance of that if we can actually in the next week, actually, before April 27, get the government to commit to expanding it to age pensioners and people on disability support pension. I think the narrowness of who gets the coronavirus supplement is, I think, part of what adds to the temporariness of the increase. But this is something that we're going to be paying for and recovering from for years. It's not just something that we'll be living with in 6 months. So that would be the first thing I would say. I think the next thing is to use this as an opportunity to build back some of our public and social housing. it's a really good opportunity to be investing in some infrastructure, some building projects. Once we can restart some of that, it will be really good for the economy. It will be able, as I said earlier, to get going a lot more quickly than a rail project would, or most other infrastructure projects would, and a lot of organisations like Anglicare, but lots of others would have ideas and potentially even shovel-ready projects. And in the medium term, I think we could look at something like some housing buybacks. There are a lot of people with their houses on the market at the moment who are not going to be able to sell them for the prices that they've come to expect. There are a lot of people who aren't going to be able to to find buyers, and this is a really good opportunity for governments to replenish some of their public and social housing stocks. And create some more affordable rentals. I think it would be good if in 5, 10, 15 years, we could look at this as a moment where our housing system changed from being one that was reliant on those private amateur landlords that Joel described earlier, who just aren't able to withstand these sorts of fluctuations in the market. And have a bit more diversity, and some of that is about government and social housing. But there are other models as well. Just some more. I think we can see at the moment some of the consequences of the lack of diversity in how we supply housing in Australia.
Beautiful, thank you, Maiy. So keeping income support permanent, expanding it, and then keeping it. Expanding public and affordable housing, and possibly buying back more housing. I love it.
You just broke up a bit again, Joel.
Oh, sorry, folks. I was just throwing it to Kate to share her thoughts. Go, Kate.
Look, I'd agree with that. And I think, look, we've been, in the advocacy space, we've been sort of thick in the sort of emergency response measures, and how do we make sure that people are off the streets, that, evictions are not proceeding, and been looking for that moment to sort of segue back to talking about the longer term and what do we need, like, to sort of, I suppose, build a better Australia, make a housing system that's fairer. So Maiy mentioned earlier the upcoming rental affordability bulletin, and I think really that's going to be one of the first opportunities that we'll use to start sort of tracking that path back away from just the emergency measures and towards the longer term housing that we need. So we'll do an Everybody's Home action alongside that rental affordability bulletin that calls for social housing investment, both immediate term social housing investment, which is really those kind of buybacks of housing, so that we've got housing to deal with that issue that I mentioned before, that around the country we'll have thousands of rough sleepers in hotels, and in 6 months we can't build the housing that we need to house them permanently. That housing will need to be kind of bought off the market. But there's a lot of, as Maiy said, a lot of housing for sale at the moment. So that would be, an amazing immediate solution, because really the main thing that rough sleepers generally need is housing. And then, but then as part of that, we need to be really sort of putting pressure on governments about social housing investment, because there's kind of a lot of things that need to be done to fix Australia's sort of broken housing system, and some of that is in the tax space, about getting rid of negative gearing and the capital gains tax exemption, or at least minimising them, so that investors are basically not getting subsidised to push up house prices. But in terms of looking after people on the lowest incomes and making sure that they're well housed, there's really no solution that's more successful than building social and affordable social housing, so public and community housing. And so I guess that's our number one strategy at the moment, is to push for that long-term solution. and any support that people can get behind, that would be really appreciated, because it's going to be pretty hard to get government to come to the table and deliver those solutions. And we've been making those arguments for a long time. So what we really need at this point is for the community to stand up, everyone who's on the call to basically stand up and join with that action, and also make their own individual representations to your local MP, or letters to the editor, other forms of advocacy like that, to get that message out there that over the coming years, we never again want to have a situation where we enter a health crisis where people are poorly housed. And to fix that, we need the social and affordable housing on the ground.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kate. I might just add a few thoughts of my own, and then we'll go to some questions. I think
Joel, you're just breaking up.
Abigail. Oh, no, it's a terrible time. I'll give myself a moment.
You want to pass to a question first, Joel?
That is a good idea. Let's pass to Abigail's question.
Oh, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for everything that you've contributed so far. It's been really interesting. This is Abigail from Per Capita. I just wanted to raise the prospect of the federal parliamentary inquiry into homelessness in Australia that's ongoing but closed for submissions at the moment, because obviously Parliament's closed, but they're going to be reopening for submissions to relate specifically to the COVID-19 response. And I know at Per Capita, we're certainly planning to expand our submission to include that. Specifically relating to what you were saying earlier, Kate, about there needing to be a plan for continuing to house rough sleepers after this is over. In terms of a concerted advocacy strategy, what recommendations should advocacy orgs be making in their submissions relating to that national strategy and that plan to continue to house rough sleepers after this?
So I think oftentimes we make the question about how do we get rough sleepers housed really complicated, and people assume, that there's like lots of sort of special measures that are needed because people have additional needs. And, often really to the extent that there are those special measures, like support needed, that those issues are funded and often largely resolved by the states. But the thing that is really the big ticket item that's missing is the housing. So I know in Victoria, we have support programs for people who are rough sleepers, but they can't get them housed. So they're still providing support to them while they're on the street. It's kind of mad, What we need is the federal government to be investing in social housing, and that would be the number one recommendation. Like, I just think I kind of can't say it enough that that's the biggest problem that we face in terms of getting rough sleepers housed in every state around the country, is that there's no housing that people who are on really low incomes can afford. And so that's the main reason why people are homeless. There's some technical issues around support that people would need, but you can cover that off by saying people might also need support. But in terms of federal spending, it's about the housing, and they need to increase the amount of funding that they provide for housing, because the federal government always argue, but we provide funding for housing, but the thing is it's decreased in real terms over a large number of years, and it costs money to run social housing portfolios because people don't pay a lot of rent, and housing providers still have to meet all of the costs of maintenance and other costs associated with running the property. And so they're loss-making enterprises. So it needs federal investment to kind of grow that pool.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. I think the Everybody's Home campaign, which Anglicare Australia is a part of as well, has put out some research showing that there's a shortfall of 500,000 social and affordable homes in Australia. And so I think if we're really serious about tackling rough sleeping, all kinds of homelessness and rental stress, then I think the government, all levels of government, need to commit to ending that shortfall.
Thanks, Kate and Maiy. Hopefully my audio is better now, although you don't get to see my fantastic Kandinsky in the background. But we had a question from David about VCAT earlier, if David wants to chime in.
Yes, I will chime in. It was really more an observation. It's a long time since I've been in this field. Hello, Kate. I love seeing you out there representing this issue. So thank you for your work, and all the advocates who are on the call. It was just an observation really that I understand that VCAT, the Residential Tenancies Tribunal in Victoria, has basically decided not to issue possession orders. So even though there is a lot of confusion, you know, if you're a landlord and you issue an eviction notice but you can't get it enforced, then you may as well have not gone to the bother of doing it. So hopefully that's good news. But it was really, you sort of answered my other question, which is what would you keep? Tax reform, as is some of the other things that you've been pushing. But this is a coalition government. Some of their backbench really hate the fact that they've acted in such a generous manner to start with. They claimed they would never increase New Start and they've doubled it. What do we think we can keep is really the thing I was asking, because is it just a bridge too far for them to do public and community housing, but maybe we can do something on the income side, or you know, waiving debts like they did with Tassie, or, you know, is there something we can get from the Commonwealth, you know, in this environment?
I mean, I think we have to be sort of ready as a group to sort of stand up and, you know, fight them on the beaches, as they say, to keep the doubling of New Start and to get social and community housing in the stimulus package. That sort of, you know, there will inevitably be a stimulus package coming out of the, you know, when things start to open up again, and we have to get public and community housing in it, and fight for that New Start to be doubled. But it's not, as I mentioned before, it's not going to be an easy fight, but I think we sort of have to steel ourselves and be ready to you know, fight hard, because we can never let the doubling of New Start go.
Can I maybe jump in on that? And this is sort of a bit of a question for Kate and for Maiy. I feel like one of the opposition points for building more social housing isn't just that it's expensive, but that it will reduce private landlord incomes, because there'll be more competition from the government. There'll be more housing in the system, so they'll be in a weaker position. And then before, Maiy, you were saying maybe government should be buying back housing as a way to almost buffer the market. So do you think that we actually either like need to see a decreasing of the intensity of the housing market and do see housing values go down? Or do you think the government should be trying to keep it at the very high levels that it's at?
Yeah, this is the tension, because people want affordable housing, but people who are housing investors don't want the value of their investment to decrease. I think the only way we're going to get that mentality to change, and this goes also to David's point about, you know, what we can keep, we'll get what we expect we can get. You know, I think one of my big lessons from the federal election last year is that it's completely fine for all of these people to go off and lobby directly to government, and a lot of Anglicare Australia and a lot of other groups had secured commitments from Labor to do this or that. But if there isn't a constituency for it in the community, then it's really not going to stick. It's not going to be a winning platform for whoever you know, commits to doing it, and it's not going to be something that anybody else is motivated to take up either. So I think it's really about building that constituency. I think the doubling of the job seeker payment will actually be, I think we've got a really good chance of keeping that, or at least extending it, just because there are going to be so many people out of work, and they are not going to be amenable or receptive to, you know, having their incomes halved in 6 months' time. Their worlds are not going to go back to normal in 6 months' time, and that's not going to be, you know, a reality that they'll be able to go back to or accept. I think we stand a better chance of keeping the increase actually if we can, as I said before, expand it to age pensioners and disability support pensioners. I think the more people who get it, the less, the more people are also, the more unwilling more people are going to be to go back to a lower rate, if that makes sense. And I think it's really, in terms of the longer term goals about more public and community housing, it's really about resetting the public's expectations and changing the conversation, which is a much longer process. And I think what we should be doing is resisting the idea that we can go back to the way things were, because that actually wasn't normal. It is not normal for millions of people to be spending 50 or 60% of their incomes on housing. It is not normal for someone to own 2 or 3 or 4 investment properties while other people are locked out of the market entirely. And it is not normal for thousands of people to be sleeping rough on the street every night. So I think, you know, we've just got to use this as it's a sad and tragic and difficult time, but it's also an opportunity for us to reset our expectations as a community.
Yeah, can I just, and I agree with what May's saying, can I just flag that the reason Everybody's Home calls for 500,000 social and affordable rental properties and not just enough social housing to house people who are homeless is partly because we want to get so much low-cost rental into the housing market that we do depress the price of properties in the private market. So that's not a pitch we would normally share with the investor cohort, but it's basically the problem at the low cost end of the rental market is that there's so many people on low incomes and there's not enough housing that's cheap. So, you know, no one actually, I don't think investors really care about us housing rough sleepers because they don't want to house them anyway. But what we're talking about is having public and community housing for a much larger group so that people have choice if they're low-income households between a public housing property, a community housing property or a private rental property, and they can find a choice that's affordable to them.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kate. And Maiy, it might be good if you could share that social research that you were involved in with Anglicare, I think last year, because I think one of the really interesting things from that is that idea around the means testing of government benefits. And you found in this research that people are much more supportive of benefits that aren't means tested and that are actually widely available in the community.
Yeah, that's right. So we did a bit of research in November 2018, and it was a big study of Australian social attitudes towards welfare and poverty in Australia. And one of the things that we found is that the most, well, firstly, we found that Australians actually have much more positive attitudes towards people who, and sympathetic attitudes towards people in poverty than we might have expected. And I think the second big finding is that benefits become less popular the more targeted they are. So for a long time, conventional wisdom has been that some benefits are targeted because they're unpopular, but actually if you trace social attitudes, what you can see is that benefits become less popular the more targeted they are, and the most universal aspects of our safety nets are actually the ones that are the most popular. So the age pension is one of the most, the age pension and Medicare are the two most popular aspects of our safety net. And the age pension, just about everyone gets a pension or a part pension. You've got to be very wealthy to not be on some form of pension, and everybody is eligible for a rebate on a Medicare payment. If you know, so whereas New Start and Youth Allowance are the least popular aspects of the safety net, and it's not a coincidence that they're also the most highly targeted. I think. Actually, that's why this moment is a real opportunity to change people's attitudes towards people who are out of work, because we are going to see more and more people come to know what it's like to have to interact with Centrelink, know what it's like to have to make some of these trade-offs, you know, and develop that sympathy. And I think to go back to the conversation we were having earlier, I think another implication for that is that we're more likely we're not going to get a win-win with investors. You know, if you want housing to be more affordable, people's investments, you know, are going to lose some value, and that's just a fact. But I think the only way to really build support for that is if there's a benefit that's as universal as possible, and if people can see how they benefit from whatever is being proposed and whatever is going to happen. So I think those are probably the big implications from that research to what we're doing here.
Beautiful. Thank you, Maiy. I think we'll just wrap it up with the three of us now and then throw it to Kirsty for the final goodbye. So I guess for you, Kate and Maiy, I'm just wondering if you sort of want to share anything, which I'd be interested in, maybe if you've taken something away from this conversation, or if there's a particular perhaps call to action or powerful thing you think people can do. Kate?
Look, I just think it's just so heartening to see, you know, there's a lot of familiar faces on the line and a lot of new people as well. So it's just so heartening to see the broad support there is among, you know, advocates and interested people in the community for working on housing issues. So I guess I would just invite you, if you haven't yet joined Everybody's Home, to join with us and help fight for this change. So you just go to everybody'shome.com.au and sign up. And I think the other thing is that, you know, we expect to get some positive outcomes for public and community housing out of this sort of calamity. You know, sometimes calamities are also an opportunity in that way, but it's also a long-term fight. So I think, you know, we'll be carrying the torch as a collective group of organisations, and all of you as well, for investment in public and community housing for a long time to come. And I guess I invite you to be, you know, warriors in that journey together with us. So thanks for everyone's interest today.
Thank you, Kate. Maiy?
I echo what Kate said about joining the Everybody's Home campaign. You absolutely should go to the website and sign up. I think I would add one more thing, which is make contact with your local MP, but don't just write to them or call them, actually ask to meet with them. And if you can get to a group of friends, you know, I think it is really important that people who are actual, you know, renters, people who actually use housing are seen as a constituency. You know, investors are seen as a constituency and landlords are a constituency, but we're the biggest constituency. And so, you know, they need to be hearing from us, and they need to be afraid of us, you know. So I think that would be my bit of advice. Get together a group of friends and get a meeting with your local MP.
Amazing. You need to be afraid of us, Maiy. What a takeaway. Kirsty, I'll throw to you in just a moment, but I just wanted to mention better renting. I haven't spoken too much about our work and how beautiful renters are and how important our issues are. But if you are someone who rents their home in particular, I encourage you to check us out, follow us on Facebook. And we also run Facebook groups for people in South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and the ACT. So those are a great group. We can actually connect with other renters, and they've been really helpful for people in this time to stay on top of what's going on. But very exciting to have this conversation. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Maiy. I hope we can also look back and see this as a turning point in how Australia does housing. And we're all part of it at this point in time. So good on us. Thank you. And Kirsty, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joel, Kate and Maiy, for hosting this session today. It really, I think, has lifted our eyes to the horizon and to think about what is necessary, not just what's possible, and encouraging us all to dream of a world where everyone has a home. So I really appreciate the candidacy and the wisdom and knowledge you've brought, and all the great questions everyone has shared. And we'll send around a link, an email today with some of the links that have been shared in this chat, as well as a feedback survey. We'd really appreciate it. We're only a few weeks into Australia at Home, so we'd love your feedback. We've got some sessions happening tomorrow, including Peter Lewis and Essential Media and Catherine Murphy sharing some polling on where community attitudes are at. And we've got conversations on debt over the coming days, and food. So check it out, and would love to see you on Australia at Home. And to wrap out, I'd like to say thanks to all the partners who make Australia at Home possible. So The Guardian, Essential, Principal Co, the Community Council of Australia and Australia Conservation Foundation. Thanks to all the partners creating this space where our community can come together and hear about some of the big issues facing people in the midst of coronavirus. So hope to see you again later this week, and otherwise have a great afternoon. And thanks so much again, Kate, May and Joel, for hosting.
Thank you.
See you all.
Thank you.